I call Scarface the canonical text of hip hop. You had a graduate student go and tabulate the number of references to Scarface in hip hop, it would be a long list.
Hey, welcome back. Thanks for tuning into Chicago Humanities Tapes, the audio arm of the live Chicago Humanities Spring and Fall Festivals. Seeing as it is, in fact, spring in Chicago, or so we keep telling ourselves, our Spring Festival is currently underway. We're bringing you a ton of just incredible live programming, which means we'll have great new stuff for the podcast coming up too. I'm Alisa Rosenthal, and I'm here to bring you the best of the biggest names and brightest minds of our live festival. Today's episode is a total treat. We have an original interview with the University of Southern California's Dr. Todd Boyd, aka the Notorious PhD, coming to you live from the Chicago Humanities Tapes studio. You can check out his gorgeous new book now. It is out on bookshelves, and it's called Rappers Deluxe: How Hip Hop Made the World. And you can check him out live in Chicago as part of our Spring Festival coming up on Saturday, May 4th. Head to chicagohumanities.org for more info and to snag those tickets. May the 4th isn't just a day for Star Wars fans. It's also one of Chicago Humanities' popular neighborhood days this year. We'll be taking over Chicago's historic Bridgeport neighborhood on the 4th for a full day filled with music, art, politics, social justice, and much more. Think of it as like Lollapalooza for stimulating conversations. You can catch programs running the gamut of topics ranging from former South Carolina state representative and CNN political analyst Bakari Sellers and graphic novelist, filmmaker, and tattooist James Spooner, plus 2 event discussions and an art exhibition focused on incarceration with our friends at PNAP, the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Education Project. Bridgeport, located on Chicago's South Side, is one of the most diverse of our 77 neighborhoods, with a history that really sums up a lot about Chicago in that there's a lot of social progress as well as discrimination that is still being reckoned with today. It's been the home to 5 Chicago mayors, and locals know it as the spot to catch the White Sox. The neighborhood has been in the news lately with the reopening of the historic Ramova Theater, a former movie theater built in 1929. The 1,300-seat theater closed its doors in the 80s until it was purchased by Emily and Tyler Nevius in 2021 from the city of Chicago for $1 in total disrepair. Its investors now include Chicago icons Chance the Rapper, Jennifer Hudson, and Quincy Jones, and it reopened in late 2023 with the theater restored and with a bar and grill. We're pleased to be hosting Dr. Todd Boyd at the Ramova Theater on May 4th, so you can check it out in person, and we hope to see you there. Please enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Boyd about his new book, as well as a bit of a heated debate about Chicago versus Detroit, and some really great music. All right, Dr. Todd Boyd, thank you so much for joining us audibly in Chicago today.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is, who is the Notorious PhD?
We don't have enough time. The LA Times did a feature on me a while ago now, back in 2003, I think it was. And the title of the article was Notorious PhD. It fit, I always like Notorious B.I.G.
Right.
And I was a bit notorious during those days myself, so it fit. And, I just ran with it. It's funny because I get the sense from some people that they feel like I crowned myself Notorious PhD. But when I was growing up, you couldn't give yourself a nickname. Somebody else had to do it. So that came from the LA Times, but it stuck, and, here I am.
And in your book, you certainly have the bona fides. You speak about being an MC at the University of Florida.
Yeah, the University of Florida is maybe not shining in the most glamorous light these days,
Sure.
thanks to some of the political decisions of the governor. But when I was in college in the early 80s, a long time ago, I used to be an MC in the early days of hip hop. At the time, the job of the MC was to move the crowd. A few years after that, when, say, Rakim came on the scene and added a certain poetic perspective to the spitting of lyrics, as it were. The game changed, and now MCs were expected to have bars. When I was doing it, it was different, and so I'm from that early era. I didn't make the transition. I have no bars for you other than, my own Notorious PhD bars, but I was always invested in the culture. This was, a time when Michael Jackson's Thriller had just come out, Prince, 1999 had just come out. Everybody I knew was listening to one or both of those records. And I've always wanted to be different. When I was coming up, you would run to the other side of the room just not to be associated with everybody else. And so they were listening to Michael and Prince, and I was bumping Grandmaster Flash and Run DMC. So those were my days as a MC long before I went to graduate school and started doing this work as a professor. But it certainly grows out of my interest and passion and participation in the culture from that perspective.
I too am a University of Iowa alum. Go Hawkeyes.
That's right. They've been getting a lot of attention because of Caitlin Clark lately, which is
basketball. Yeah.
Because not too many things happen in Iowa that people like Travis Scott. So
yeah. Now, talking about academics, if there was a thesis statement to Rappers Deluxe, what would it be?
A thesis statement. That's an interesting way to put it. I've thought of this, as a 50-year history of hip hop as a cultural movement. A lot of people, when they hear hip hop, they think of the music, and the music's certainly, important, but it's more than that. And I think if it were only just the music, we wouldn't be talking about it 50 years later. So it's how the culture developed, and the connections from music to film and art and sports and fashion and politics and language and so many other things over an extended period of time. I mean, we're talking about, half a century. And as I have been saying to people, there are no 50-year trends or 50-year fads. Trends and fads and cycles come and go much quicker, but hip hop's been around for 50 years, and it's affected and sort of influenced a lot of different things beyond where it initially started. So I sort of sum up the book that way.
Yeah, I love that. I think my favorite aspect of the book was using hip hop as a way to look at American history, Black American history, and different facets of culture and subculture and counterculture, the way you hit fashion, sports. I'm excited to get into all of it.
I mean, when I think about it, it touches all those different things in various ways. There's always been a fashion component. Hip hop has always been affected by and responded to the politics of the day. Someone said to me, I've never seen a hip hop book that included Angela Davis. And I'm like, she's, to me, part of this evolution. We talk about presidents from Ronald Reagan to Bill Clinton to hip hop helping to elect Barack Obama. When you think about the way people talk, I mean, so much of sort of people's conversation these days, far removed from the culture, is inspired by hip hop, and they don't even know it. So many things people say these days came from, say, hip hop, but it's filtered through the culture in such a way that, you have, conservative right-wing politicians saying things that come from hip hop, and they have no idea that that's where it came from. It's gotten to be so popular. So I was interested in that movement, and interested in how it connects to history. You mentioned Black history. Certainly, to me, it's American history. And it's an interesting way to look at the last 50 years of American history through a lens that doesn't normally get, thought of in this way.
Yeah, and I found as I was reading the book that it has so much energy and vibrancy, and large sections of it are just so fun. Was it intentional to go for that vibe?
I mean, I don't know that I consciously thought I want this to be fun. I think what comes through, and that's a, compliment, so thank you. I think what comes through is the fact that it's fun for me. I run into a lot of people and they want to, talk about all the negative things that they could attach to hip hop. And, there's certainly things about hip hop that continue to demand attention in that way. But I came out of the culture, I love the culture. It's who I am. So when I'm talking about, certain artists or certain albums, I'm talking about things that I like. When I talk about, Gucci sneakers from the 1980s and Fila sneakers, kind of at the moment Air Jordans are coming out, I'm talking about things that were in my closet, things that, I myself wear, things that I have a great appreciation for. I'm relating debates I've had with, friends. And so, it's personal. And I try to articulate that through the perspective of history, sort of critical analysis. But sometimes just describing it, I'm sort of sharing with the reader, or hope to share with the reader, my own interest, my own passion. And, some things are funny and it's kind of cool to remember them. I hope all that comes through when people read the book.
Yeah, I would say it definitely does. And I think you do a wonderful job of holding some decisions individuals make that are less than savory, while also understanding the significance that they've contributed to the culture. So it makes it a really thoughtful read. Like you've got us.
Thank you. I mean, I found myself not wanting to kind of, recollect all of the sort of talking points that tend to get connected with hip hop. I wanted to do something beyond that. And, I think there's certainly individuals who have done some amazing things, and some of those individuals have made some questionable choices or done some other things that were problematic. And two things can exist at once. I mean, you can be, a significant groundbreaking figure, and you could also do some things that, need to be criticized. And that's not a contradiction. So I wanted to be able to do that, say, you can't just dismiss this person because, they said or did something you didn't like. But at the same time, you can't ignore that certain things also come into the equation as well. And sometimes that's a delicate balance. And I hope that I managed to achieve the right balance in doing that.
If that's not America, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what passes for discourse these days, conversation, it's either or. And things are often more complicated than that. The either or is maybe sometimes a bit too simplistic. So I wanted to go beyond that.
Yeah. You did such a lovely job of assembling stories and anecdotes and pieces of pop culture history that I didn't know about. I really found interesting the story of Sylvia Robinson, if you wouldn't mind speaking a little of who she was.
Well, Sylvia Robinson is the godmother, not to be confused with Griselda Blanco, the recent Netflix series. But, Sylvia was a R&B singer, and even before doing R&B, I think I mentioned in the book, Mickey and Sylvia, a song called Love is Strange.
Babe.
There you go.
Oh, well.
Which is very prominent in Martin Scorsese's film Casino. That's Sylvia. And, in the early 70s, I remember watching Sylvia perform on Soul Train when she was going by the name Sylvia, singing Pillow Talk, one of her big hits. By the late 70s, she wants to, capture the experience of a, rap music event on record. It was experiential, but it hadn't been sort of captured on a record. And, she's the force behind it. Subsequently starting Sugar Hill Records. Her son, as the story goes, is in a pizza parlor and he hears, some guys kind of rapping along to a song. And, next thing you know, they're in the studio recording. They've never recorded before as a group. The lyrics are from, Grandmaster Caz's rhyme book. This is the group ultimately known as, the Sugar Hill Gang. And of course, their song is Rapper's Delight. This was not a group. It was sort of put together for the purpose of making this record. But of course, the record would be, a huge hit and really introduce the world to the genre of hip hop. So Sylvia, to me, is very prominent in that regard. And I think her place in the culture is something that should be routinely acknowledged and celebrated because, this was a Black woman at the forefront of bringing the culture to the masses. Previously, unless you were in New York and in those communities, when the culture was underground, you didn't experience it. You couldn't experience, but because of Sylvia, you were able to experience it wherever you were. You could hear it on the radio, you could buy the record, and that's the foundation, that would, build the culture going forward. So I think Sylvia is hugely important.
Absolutely. We already see how aspects of American pop culture are feeling like hip hop. Your deep love of film comes through, and I also have a deep love of film, which made the book very fun to read. So I thought it was really interesting how you dedicated a chapter to Blaxploitation and the centering of fringe art movements and how that felt like hip hop or how that would later become more like hip hop.
Well, I think Blaxploitation and many of the things that I talk about in the book's first chapter in the 70s, these were all, cultural examples that were out in the open while hip hop was underground. Hip hop was developing. And in future generations, future decades, we could see the influence of Blaxploitation on the development of hip hop. But in the early to mid 1970s, Blaxploitation is it. One of the stories I tell, of course, at the beginning of the book is the famous sort of origin story of DJ Kool Herc throwing this party in the South Bronx. The party has become kind of this mythical legend, this origin story of hip hop. And in doing my research, I found out that the same week, the number one movie at the box office is Pam Grier's film Coffee. Which, if you think about it, is really kind of fascinating because, this is the number one film at the box office and hip hop's underground. But of course, when you get to the 90s, you have a rapper like Foxy Brown who appropriates her name from another Pam Grier film. And of course, Tarantino's film Jackie Brown, which stars Pam Grier, 2 decades later. And so, movies like Superfly and The Mac, these were all really influential in terms of, the development of gangster rap in the late 1980s. And so Blaxploitation, which has gotten, I think, a bad rap. A lot of people don't even know what it is. They use that term and apply it to anything. But Blaxploitation is less of a genre and more of an era. And so I felt I needed to include that as well as a lot of other examples of the culture from the 70s that were above ground and visible while hip hop was developing underground.
You mentioned Scarface. We look at the films of Quentin Tarantino, and then we look at The Wire, really significant pieces of media in the culture. How are those hip hop?
Well, I call Scarface the canonical text of hip hop. In the mid 80s, this was such an influential film. And even beyond, of course. If you had a graduate student go and tabulate the number of references to Scarface in hip hop, it would be a long list. including the rapper Brad Jordan from Houston, otherwise known as Scarface. So, I mean, that movie was, hugely influential. It certainly was influential to me, as well as, numerous other rappers and hip hop figures. And so you can't really talk about hip hop in the 80s without talking about Scarface, and certainly the development of gangster rap in a lot of ways is fueled by the sort of imagery you get in a film like Scarface. The Wire, I mean, in the 2000s, when you get into that chapter, I mean, just a groundbreaking example of, television. Watching The Wire, of course, is become kind of a sign of good taste these days. I think, people tell you they love The Wire. It's kind of a way of saying, I have really good taste in the culture I consume.
It comes up on first dates all the time.
It's people who watched it, it's hard not to feel that way. It was such a incredible, piece of material. And a lot of the elements in The Wire, of course, you heard people rapping about before the series even started, that urban street culture, drug culture. So all of these things, you heard about in hip hop. Some of these things happened prior to hip hop expanding. At some point, there's maybe even a bit of cross-pollination between the two. I mean, Scarface comes out in 83. There's been discussion for years that they should sort of recut it and do it with a hip hop soundtrack. And Brian De Palma doesn't like that idea, which I think is sort of annoying, because hip hop made that film in a lot of ways. It hadn't performed as desired at the box office, but this is the era of VHS tapes, and I think a lot of people in hip hop culture discovered this film on VHS and kind of made it a hit, even after it had not been a hit necessarily at the box office. So it demonstrates the influence and power of a community of people to make something relevant that maybe hadn't succeeded as was anticipated when it was released.
I really love how the book is broken into decades. You're really just moving through time. And the 90s really feels like the centerpiece of the book.
I've been telling people the 70s chapter, which is chapter 1, was the most fun to write. And the 90s, which is chapter 3, was the longest and hardest to write, because just so much happened in the 90s. I mean, everything, just, the culture really exploded. And there's just so much to touch on, from the early part of the decade when hip hop is still sort of making its way into the mainstream, around the time of the Rodney King riots and, sort of historical event like this, but also just as the music is expanding exponentially and you're getting these new artists and these new groups, Public Enemy and Chuck D, Ice Cube going solo and bringing a political component, and then later Dr. Dre and Snoop, adding to that sort of West Coast transformation of the culture before Nas and Wu-Tang and Biggie Smalls come along. And of course, Tupac's in the mix as well. But you also get, a series of movies like Malcolm X and Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, during this particular time. And, these hip hop fashion lines like, FUBU and Cross Colors and other such things, Sean John. So there's just so many things happening in the 90s that by the time you get to the end of the 90s, Lauryn Hill is racking up Grammy Awards, which people sort of see as a really significant moment now relative to recent conversations about, hip hop's place at the Grammys. But I remember watching Lauryn Hill when she, collected all those Grammys that night. And at one point she says, "This is crazy because this is hip hop music," And at that time it was crazy. Now it's an issue in a different way, but at that time it was crazy because hip hop hadn't always got the recognition and respect that it deserved. And so Lauren is saying, as she's racking up all these Grammy Awards, it's kind of amazing that, hip hop had reached this point now of critical acclaim within the industry after such a difficult time in its earlier manifestation. So the 90s is the longest chapter. It was the hardest to write, but it's such a important moment because by the end of the 90s, hip hop was at a very, very different place than it was when we started the book back in the early 70s.
I really liked how you used award shows as the marker of progress and mainstreaming of the culture. So, for example, Lauryn Hill winning Grammys, and there was a lot of significance in the early 2000s, specifically at the Oscars.
Right. That was 2002 Academy Awards when Denzel Washington and Halle Berry, both won, Denzel for Training Day and Halle for Monsters Ball, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Sidney Poitier received a Lifetime Achievement Awards of sorts that evening. And so he was in the house, and Denzel, of course, shouts him out in his acceptance speech. Considering back in the early 1960s, Sidney Poitier was only the second African-American to win an Academy Award. And here we are, all those years later, and Denzel was only the second African-American to win the Academy Award for Best Actor after Sidney Poitier. So you went from the early 60s to the early 2000s, and even though more, Black actors had won awards, including, Denzel, it was only the second time that a Black actor had won in the Best Actor category. And Halle Berry was the first time a Black woman won in the Best Actress category. So, it was a very historic moment for sure. And when you look at Denzel's performance in Training Day, I think of Training Day as a hip hop film. It's tied around the Rampart scandal and the history of the LAPD, recent history during that time. But Dr. Dre, Snoop are in the film. It's a sort of LA film, but not the traditional LA that people expect. It's, East LA, South Central, and, just to me, very much a hip hop film. And, if anybody, of course, remembers the film, Denzel's monologue at the end, King Kong, 23-hour lockdown, shoe pro. That's to me the essence of hip hop. That was, sort of hip hop meets Shakespeare. So just a really important moment for him individually, for Halle Berry individually, but also, the culture. And then a few years later, 3 6 Mafia, shocked the world when they won an Academy Award, So things had changed, at least at that time in the Oscars, in terms of what was being recognized. And I felt like hip hop had a great deal to do with it.
Well, I've just got a couple more questions for you. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Chicago connection within hip hop. Michael Jordan is a major figure in the book, as well as Obama. What are the Chicago connections within hip hop culture?
Well, I can't answer that question without saying I'm from Detroit. So whatever else I say will be relative to the fact that, much love to Chicago, but I can't talk about Chicago without at least acknowledging Detroit. But
totally fair.
When you think about Michael Jordan and his success, once the Pistons got through dominating the NBA, Michael had his shot. But certainly Air Jordans and the role of, sneaker culture as well. Again, when we talk about figures who've been repeatedly referenced in hip hop, Michael Jordan is at, or near the top of that list for sure. He was iconic because of all his success. His sneakers are a huge part of, say, the fashion of hip hop. And again, you kind of have to respect what he accomplished. And of course, Obama, when you get to chapter 4, I tell the story about Obama on the campaign trail. And, there's a moment when he brushes his shoulders off, like the Jay-Z song says. And this is a presidential candidate, you wouldn't expect John McCain, his opponent, to even know what that was. So it's very cool to see Obama do this. People like to talk about Bill Clinton playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall, but I think there was something much more authentic about what Obama did when he brushed his shoulders off in reference to his critics. And once Obama became president, of course, he welcomed hip hop into the White House. I tell a story about his conversation during a meeting with Kendrick Lamar. Throughout the time, Barack and Michelle Obama were in the White House. Hip hop was often represented. Rappers, NBA players, and others were welcomed into the White House. And I think it was cool to see figures from these aspects of culture interacting with the president and first lady in a way that was very different, than anything we'd ever seen. I mean, this is part of being the first Black president, but both Obama and Jordan, are huge. And, shout out to Chicago for that. Because, we're talking about two of the most important figures in American history. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge this, in spite of the fact that, I'm from Detroit, and you have to point out the fact that much love to Chicago, but that competition between Chicago and Detroit doesn't die.
Again, totally fair.
I've been in LA for so long now that, I'm sort of referencing the historic Detroit. When I first moved to LA, one of the first people, ironically, I met was Verdine White of Earth, Wind, and Fire, a great, Chicago legend in his own right. I remember a conversation I had with Verdine, and he was saying, Detroit and Chicago, if we're back home, there's that rivalry. But once you get out here to LA, it's all good. It's love. It's like Midwest. So we're like cousins. So, much love to Chicago because, I've been in LA for a long time, and I'm going to always represent Detroit, but I appreciate the Chi very much. And what Chicago has contributed to hip hop culture and American culture is undeniable.
I'm there with you. At the end of the day, we're just Midwesterners.
at the end of the day.
I really love the photos in this book. It's one of the most exciting parts is just the number of photos, how beautiful the photos are, how well they are assembled. Was there anything notable in tracking down a particular photo?
Well, one of the things that was enjoyable about writing this book for me was the opportunity to not only write it, but to curate the images. And so in terms of the photos, a lot of these things, I have or had seen before, had in mind. And then there were other instances where I maybe discovered something. I had a lot of support. I had a great assistant, and I had, great sort of editorial support. There was a point when certain people, I guess we won't name them, were like, no, I don't want to be in the book, and you never know with these things. Is it the actual person or is it, their team? But then there were other cases, and I think this is one that stands out for me. I have a famous vintage Nike poster as one of the images in the book. It is the great George Gervin. A photo of George Gervin sitting on blocks of ice. He was, of course, known as the Iceman. And I had this poster on my wall when I was in college. And I was speaking, at the Nike campus in Oregon once, and I mentioned this. And when I got finished, someone gave me a autographed copy of that poster. But there's a point in the process of the book when the editor said to me, we have cleared the Nike George Gervin poster. And, Mr. Gervin asked that I send this personal message to you. He said, thank Dr. Boyd for including me in his book. Now, George Gervin's from Detroit, number one. he's the Iceman. He's one of the most, iconic figures in the history of the NBA. And as I say, I had that poster on my wall in college. And the poster itself is actually based on a Iceberg Slim album cover, which is also in the book. And maybe the origin for that, I think, is an Esquire magazine cover linked to a James Baldwin article. So it's a really interesting series of connections. But in sort of, thinking about all that, it's the fact that George Gervin would send me this personal message. The Iceman sent me this personal message. That just meant the world to me.
That's amazing. My last question for you is, you use the term king a lot. Who's a king?
Well, I think there are multiple kings. That's a cool word because, you could talk about LeBron James, King James. I talk in the book about the Jean-Michel Basquiat painting, most young kings get their heads cut off, and the sort of visibility of the crown in Basquiat's work. I'd like to think I'm a king. I have to pull my crown out every now and then to let people know. But back in the day, guys like Duke Ellington and Count Basie appropriated titles from, European nobility as ways of distinguishing themselves. And maybe more recently, the metaphor of king has come to serve the same purpose. In terms of this book, it's my book, so I'm the king.
Hear, hear. Dr. Todd Boyd, thank you so much for your time. I can't wait to see you at the Ramova Theater in Chicago. I'll be there, and people are just going to love this book. Can't wait.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to it myself. Thank you very much.
Chicago Humanities Tapes is produced and hosted by me, Alisa Rosenthal, with help from the great staff at Chicago Humanities. For more information on Dr. Todd Boyd, such as a link to tickets to his live event on May 4th with Open Mike Eagle, and more information on his book, Rappers Deluxe, head to chicagohumanities.org. Since we're in live festival season, we'll be back with some shorter programming for podcast listeners over the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for these mini tapes. It's going to be one great moment from one great program. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay human.